Hello and welcome to today's webinar from the Well-Built Environment Forum. Today we're discussing CapEx versus whole life cost from a sustainability by design. My name's Amit Patel. I am the head of professional practice in construction, and it's great to have, I think we've got over 700 people that are registered and over 50 countries. So there's a great attendance, and I think it's a very hot topic at the moment. We've got such a great audience here with us, and we've got the greatest panelists as well that have taken their time out today to kind of share and impart their knowledge in sustainability from clients, from advisor, from consultancy, and from a contracting base as well. I'd want to share a little bit about them, and then they can introduce themselves. We've got Andrew Kidd from the National Highways from the Lower Thames Programme. We've got Matthew Tallis, who's from Arcadis. We've got John Spittle from WIEHAG, Timber Construction, and we've got Chloe from KPMG as an advisory role. I'd like to get Chloe to introduce herself, and we can pass it on to the rest of the panelists.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm Chloe Cochran. I've been a chartered surveyor since 2004, having worked in South Africa, the UK, and briefly in Canada as well. Currently involved in our infrastructure advisory role at KPMG, heavily involved in commercial advisory and assurance on major infrastructure projects across the UK.
Thank you, Chloe. I'm going to go to John next from WIEHAG.
Good afternoon. I'm John Spittle from WIEHAG Timber Construction. I'm the UK and Ireland representative. I've been in off-site construction for nearly 38 years, mainly at the sort of sharp end in the sort of commercial, estimating sales, and what have you, but also in sort of national contracts, design groups, and also systems developments. I've been sort of involved in all the different types of timber off-site construction and light gauge steel frame, and have been at WIEHAG for over nearly 12 years now. And they're a Austrian glulam manufacturer that offers design, supply, and installation, and have done some of the sort of largest, most complex timber structures in the world.
Thank you, John. And next we'll go to Andrew Kidd.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kidd from National Highways. I'm the Director of Environmental Sustainability for something called the Lower Thames Crossing Programme, which is a nearly £10 billion infrastructure programme in the UK. And I'll be talking about some of our thoughts on how environmental sustainability fits into existing frameworks for cost management and how we think about decisions as an infrastructure client.
Thank you, Andrew. And next we'll go to Matthew. Matthew, how you doing?
Superb, thank you for asking, and good day to all. So Matthew Tallis, I work for Arcadis as the Global Service Director for Cost and Commercial Management in our mobility business that covers road, rail and aviation. My background is a chartered surveyor with the RICS. Within Arcadis, I'm leading the rollout of the whole life cost service and the production of training to supplement and support our cost managers understanding more as well in this topic. I'm also implementing life cycle costs onto a large rail portfolio in the UK at the moment, based from the lovely city of Birmingham. So you may hear some lovely parts of the Brummie accent in the UK. I'm really excited to listen and discuss with the panels, and also hear from the audience about questions and comments that they've got. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. It's great to see that we know from a surveying community that we kind of input into such large projects and discussing sustainability, I guess. Let's kick off. In addition to kind of what we do as expenditure in terms of CapEx, how do whole life costs and how they're related to sustainability and social values? Matthew, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, so from a construction perspective, yes, there is a direct and clear relation. When we talk about sustainability, we reference measuring carbon, meeting biodiversity requirements, enhancing social value within the communities, and embracing circularity in project life cycles. Just to give you some examples. And whole life cycle assessments feed into all of those. You know, if you're measuring operations, renewal, maintenance, end of life, construction, they're all cost drivers. but they also drive sustainability and social value factors as well. So understanding and measuring those are also going to be key and have a direct relation. So how we measure those, who measures those, and the data analytics it generates will be really key items moving forward in future. So that's something we probably need to explore as an industry. So it'd be really interesting to hear as well what the rest of the panel believe, what's applicable, and maybe how we can collaborate further as an audience.
Thank you, Matthew. And in terms of just kind of linking into that, do you think this is a kind of a new step change for surveying practices in doing?
I do think so. As we move to standardization, automation, and as we progress as surveyors in the industry, I think the role may change. So we do become and have more of a positive impact on sustainability in future. So doing more sustainability items like carbon assessments, like social impact assessments is likely to be part of the role moving forward, and it's going to become more and more important in projects and business cases as well. So I do think that is an area that as surveyors are going to start seeing further growth and requests as well to support projects in future.
Brilliant. And I just want to bring probably Andrew into the fold into this in terms of, I say, putting your client hat back on. What's that kind of step change look like, especially from a client perspective? Because we look at sustainability and it's kind of those big kind of hot topics at the moment. But if it's not driven by the client, then where does it come from? Do you kind of get, is it mandated, or is it something that you really want to do and trying to make an impact?
Well, I mean, I think it is a step change, and actually it's a very big step. I think this is going to look like quite a radical shift. And when we think about it, environmental sustainability, social value, they're very different parameters to cost. These are things that have immense value, but they're very hard to monetize and equate to cost. They're not measured in GDP. Our economic models can't easily cope with them. And I think the sort of shift we will see in the built environment is a move from looking at these issues with a mindset of mitigating loss to ecosystems or mitigating the impact of our pollution to a world where fundamentally the built environment has to be compatible with thriving ecosystems, stable climate, the world as we want to see it. So those of us who work in this industry, our job is going to be much more fundamentally about growing natural capital. It's about improving social outcomes and supporting the economy. So we'll stop looking at it as a trade-off between those three things, and actually we'll fundamentally have to deliver all three. And in that context, actually the need to try and equate the three maybe isn't quite so important. You just need to deliver benefit on all three lenses.
Thank you, Andrew. I think they're all kind of intrinsically linked at some point, but it takes our industry to kind of use this and map it out. John, I'm really interested in terms of the innovations that are provided, especially from a material point of view. Is there something that you can explore from an ESG perspective or from a social value perspective in terms of, especially in your realm of timber?
Yeah, I mean, timber used to be perceived as very an old-fashioned material, but the changes in design, production and installation technology has really been a game changer and made it into this low carbon solution for the 21st century. But it's like any material, you have to play to its strengths and you can't just sort of shoehorn it in. So it's not just a change in material we're looking at here. You've got to really get early engagement and make sure you're using the right materials in the right situation rather than just try and, we've got to be green, we've got to use timber sort of thing on there. I mean, really, whole life costs really do force people to consider a whole range of materials, and it does mean using products like timber, which are not only sustainable but renewable, which all other building materials are finite. And so I think it also sort of whole life costs really sort of acknowledge the potential of unintended consequences and take this longer term thinking. And so it is definitely needed, but it's just how much clients want it. We find unless clients really want it, it's unlikely to happen on a project. That's our experience.
Brilliant, thank you, John. And that kind of the word you use is kind of really upfront and that kind of advice that's been given. Chloe, maybe you want to expand on in terms of the advice you're giving to your clients, I guess, especially from an infrastructure point of view. What does that look like?
Well, I think the getting expertise in early in the the supply chain involved early is something that is definitely starting to trend. It's a Project 13 principle, and it is meant to drive efficiencies, come up with the solutions early in the project, and actually design for those and limit any risks later on in the project life cycle. I think what we're looking at really is that, and focusing on limiting risks throughout the project life cycle. And if you don't consider, for instance, climate impact on your project, you might not have that the issues or see any kind of issues up front, but you're definitely going to experience possible risks and additional costs in the long run. Not only that, it could influence your insurance costs. So definitely seeing a shift to thinking about whole life costing from the very early stages of a project. And I think that's also supported in the business cases that we're seeing, initiatives like NHS screening business cases. So there are big organizations pushing towards identifying those benefits up front, making sure that they are their metrics to measure those, and making sure that they are measured, the performance against those are measured throughout the life cycle of the project.
You know, it's great that you kind of picked up on that point of having that early intervention. I think it had a news flash today where I think it was in Dubai, they've just signed X amount of billions to put new drainage in, which, this is climate change. This is happening now, and we're people are seeing the effects of it. And it's not a kind of afterthought. If we can think about it firsthand and use that knowledge that we have to spend that CapEx up front, and I think it's preventional really. It's more kind of preventive maintenance rather than anything else, and it should be a part of your kind of CapEx policies. I'm going to kind of move on to the next question now. Kind of what extent does kind of short-term cost for you over long-term savings? So this is like using CapEx versus OpEx, and the kind of greater kind of sustainably favoured on construction and infrastructure projects. What are we seeing in terms of shift towards more of a whole life cost approach? And Matthew, maybe you want to take this one.
Absolutely. So historically, capital expenditure has taken priority. We've seen key decisions taken to the scope of a project based on CapEx, which has been how funded envelopes of projects are produced, formed, and then projects are expected to control the cost on that basis. So life cycle and whole life cost may be included in the business case or the investment analysis, but it was CapEx that would be driving the major decisions on scope, quality, and program. But we're starting to see that to change. So more frequently now, life cycle, whole life costs are being requested with the CapEx costs, so decisions are being made and informed on with all of those factors. And that's due to funders, organisations, greater understanding the opportunities for being more efficient with buildings, with assets. There's starting to be examples now of projects that have had whole life cost at the forefront and have made strong operational maintenance savings that benefit the organisation. An example of that's ProRail, who are a Netherlands organisation responsible for maintenance and extension of the rail infrastructure. They've invested heavily in a risk-based approach to where they put their resources, so assets don't fail as much, and it's produced significant savings in the operation and the maintenance of those assets. So there's now examples out there for funders, for organisations that can put whole life costs at the forefront and make those decisions. And that also does enable more sustainable long-term solutions in place. So I think we are, yes, starting to see that shift, certainly more so in the transport industry at present. I think it might be slightly more mature in other industries like property, who had to consider whole life cost in completing assessments like BREEAM. But it'd be good to hear further from yourself and others.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we've seen. I think it's maybe a mind shift of actually analysing at least, or having a look at it to understand what that looks like up front, rather than having it spread over the cap of the OpEx of the lifespan of the building. And there's always that kind of short view of where you spend your CapEx, because it's hard, because you've got limited resources. Andrew, I want to kind of bring you into the fold in terms of the projects you're working with and how that's affected you, kind of especially in your kind of projects, in terms of having that CapEx up front to being able to kind of future-proof. And we're looking at public spending, we're looking at public money, and it affects all of us, and how it affects kind of public projects.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. I mean, I think for me, it's kind of linked to John's point in terms of what drives the construction industry is client demand. But clients are themselves then driven by legislation, regulation, and commercial opportunity. So when it comes to more sustainable thinking in the way in which we develop our projects, the Climate Change Act and the Environment Act in the UK are massive drivers now. It's slowly percolating through the system, but those pieces of headline legislation are really going to become big drivers for client organisations. And there is increasingly evidence that there is demand for more sustainable product, and you can start seeing that in the kind of premiums that you can get for commercial property that's developed on a more sustainable basis. And then you look at the construction process itself, and actually there's opportunity there as well. And maybe products like John's are actually better. So not only do they give you a better environmental footprint, but actually they may be better for the job than what you would have used before. And I guess my experience, leading client organisations, whether they're in the private or the public sector, are actually pretty good at this. They've got a really deep understanding of the business case for their own investment in their infrastructure. And they can respond to all sorts of differing needs that may even be conflicting, and then translate those into a practical set of requirements for the construction sector. That doesn't always need lots of sophisticated modelling. There are all sorts of mechanisms that client organisations use to do that. And a business like mine, National Highways, we use standards to drive whole life cost thinking. So baked into our requirement is essentially a product that will do what we need it to do in terms of the long term. So there are various ways in which we try and simplify the equation so that we can get the optimal result.
Thank you, Andrew. John, I'm going to come over to you, and and looking at kind of CapEx versus kind of the OpEx, especially from that materiality point of view. What have you seen, especially from your perspective, especially from clients? Are they, I don't want to put it down as like a tick box exercise of going green, but are they looking at the upfront CapEx cost versus the OpEx later on?
You're right. Some of it is a tick box with some clients. They've just been told to tick a green box and they've got no intention. It does really depend on the sector and the client. We're seeing carbon a few years ago was just a bit of a nice to have, but now we are getting people saying the client wants this to be a low carbon construction. It will happen, and that's the great thing. And then everyone can work together and make it happen on there. But it really does seem to be client driven. But as Andrew was just saying, the legislation that's starting to come through is starting to affect. We find planning in some countries, they're favouring low carbon. And again, it's just making clients very aware of the carbon footprint of their estate. And if they can build a low carbon solution in and look at the whole life of the products, then that they will. But it is really dependent on the client and on the sector. There isn't just sort of one thing fits all really with it. But also I'm finding as younger people are percolating through the industry, getting into more senior roles, they seem to be pushing it as well, really, which is really positive to see, as obviously they're seeing the global catastrophe that's happening, and they're not content to just, because really how we're building isn't working, and really just carrying on doing the same old things we're doing. I think everyone realising we do need to sort of make a change, I think.
I think that there's some astonishing facts that we need to reduce our carbon footprint just globally by 90% just to even hit our targets and to remain at that 1.5 level of degrees. And then government should be doing more. Chloe, I'm trying to bring you into the fold in terms of that advisory role from a government perspective. What do you think you've got much influence over that, or do you think it's going to be case by case basis and what works in their country really?
I think legislation is definitely going to drive the approach to whole life costing and even funding, especially in countries like the UK. We've got safety is a big aspect, which unfortunately I think that could potentially be a blocker for certain innovation. Safety, it comes first in many industries, and I think, you know, with the Building Safety Act and a large amount of expenditure now going towards remediating cladding on large residential buildings, you've got less opportunity, I think, to innovate for various developers, and also less cash flow. So we've got an operating environment at the moment where there is less cash flow. Margins are relatively tight. There have been a lot of disruptions in the markets over the last few years: COVID, unrest, hyperinflation, and so margins are tight. Cash flows are very limited. If you've got a large portfolio, you've got more opportunity, I think, to spread that cost and add value to the most significant projects. But it's very difficult when you've got smaller projects to really identify those benefits, measure those benefits, and actually you don't have that longevity to see the outcomes. So I think it will be more industry specific, but also I think when you've got large publicly financed programs and portfolios, you're probably going to see a bigger drive, better frameworks to support that that are coming and being grown endemically in those programs.
Do you think we need to see more kind of green funding in what we're doing in our industry?
So there are frameworks in place, and we're starting to see a lot more projects actually reach out and use that type of green funding. But what it does is it does need that basis where you can actually demonstrate how you're going to achieve those benefits. So it comes to that question of how easy is it to measure, to baseline your whole life sustainability benefits, in order to demonstrate that to a funder that if they're going to fund you on a basis of achieving certain goals, that you can actually realistically meet those.
Brilliant, thank you, Chloe. I think we're going to move on to our next question, which is like, how can organisations balance the upfront cost because we all know that it's a lot more expensive to go greener upfront of whole life costs of a project that we need to kind of finance across multiple projects. So if we've got a whole portfolio of works, how do we choose which one gets the green credentials or which one gets all the ESGs? Because it's that decision choice, isn't it? It's that, you know, we need to make a mindful decision. We can't do everything at once, but we need to do something. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, I mean, the financing or green financing is one aspect of that. That's external. It does help with cash flow and financial capability for developers and for large construction companies. There's the green finance strategy in the UK, and they have set up certain funding initiatives for green funding. There's also private finance initiatives. But I think the other aspect of that is actually looking for efficiencies within actual projects themselves. So looking at cutting costs, ways to cut costs, ways to be more efficient with disposal of waste and with resources. So we're seeing large organizations like Network Rail, where they are reorganizing their capital investment delivery models internally to try and do away with multiple resources doing the same type of job. So driving efficiencies there, which frees up additional capital in order to fund a bigger portfolio or to fund those whole life cost requirements. Yeah, I did mention as well the Grenfell tragedy and the Building Safety Act. And what we're also seeing is where you don't potentially have opportunities to create further efficiencies. So you're mandated to spend the money. What certain organizations are looking at is trying to level out their work bank. So trying not to add risk to their cash flow with creating demand-led inflation, where, for instance, you have all your projects happening at the same time and a limited amount of suppliers, being able to driving inflation there. So those are other ways to look at efficiencies in terms of your carrying out your portfolio and your work bank.
Thank you, Chloe. Matthew, I want to kind of bring this question to you in terms of, how do clients choose which projects to choose from, and which project gets the kind of green credentials and what doesn't? Because we know that 80% of our portfolio is going to be here until 2050. What do we do about the existing stock, and then what do we do about new projects? How do you balance that out, do you think?
I think you've got to look at those that are going to have the most impact. Certainly in terms of transport, what's going to have the most impact from a project's perspective. And within the transport industry, there will be business cases that be put forward, and depending on the different BCRs and the statistics that shows, you tend to go for the one that has the maximum impact in terms of whether it's passenger numbers or imprint on the local area. So that's how you'd look at it. But in terms of the question as well, I'd focus on highlighting the benefits of consistent funding across multiple projects, because if you're able to fund a number of those multiple projects, the likelihood of the compounding impact is going to be higher. The more you do of those projects as well, the likelier you are to become efficient, to learn the lessons, to get better as well in balancing those upfront costs, and the more accurate and the more data you're going to have. So I think if you can strike that balance of replicating those benefits across a number of projects, you can then also see a compounding effect.
I think we're kind of angling this now to whoever holds the purse strings now, that kind of makes that kind of final decision. Andrew, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, if you forgive me for being a bit cheeky, I think it's wrong to equate going green with additional cost.
Okay. Prove me wrong.
At Thames Crossing, we put it out tender. We asked for low carbon construction. We knocked 50% out of the carbon footprint of the scheme, out of building the scheme, for no additional cost. And actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that it saved us money. And what's happened is we've really engaged the engineering brain on tackling the carbon question, and it's resulted in a more efficient, effective build that saved us money. And we don't think we would have got those savings if we hadn't been pushing so hard on carbon. So I think it's probably a bit lazy to sort of assume that you necessarily have to pay more for a more sustainable product. But perhaps you do have to be a bit more creative about how you bring it to market and about how you drive it and how you manage it.
I'm really interested in what you guys have achieved. I mean, could you give us a kind of example? Is this working really up front collaboratively with the design team and with the contractor really on board, or is this kind of actually we designed it to make sure it is efficient as possible in the first place?
I mean, clearly this is quite a long program, and probably all of those things will happen over the course of the program. In terms of the 50% carbon saving that I'm talking about, that essentially was driven through procurement, and I guess it's sort of not rocket science. Really, two main components of it. One is classic value engineering, so building less of stuff and getting more material efficient in the design in terms of what we build. And then the second part is looking at alternative materials or versions of materials that have a lower carbon footprint, so lower carbon intensity steel or concrete. And what that starts driving is a much more sort of engaged relationship deeper into the supply chain. So you're starting to, we are seeing kind of more innovation coming through our supply chain, a real appetite actually throughout the supply chain to kind of bring more cutting edge products rather into the market. And the result of that is you're getting more creativity and innovation in the project. You're creating a culture that drives some of the things you'd like to see anyway in terms of cost saving and a better performing product. And it's been triggered by this sort of invitation to do something really radical with carbon.
John, maybe you want to kind of step in and talk about some of those innovation bits. And Andrew was talking about being collaborative, about what is it that we haven't yet used, or is it innovative materials, or is it change of behaviours that have put those cost savings in there?
I think Andrew hit the right word, is collaborative. A collaborative approach. No one person has all the answers, whereas you get collaboration on a project with early engagement with key packages. Yes, there is a risk in that, both for for us, the subcontractor, put an early input because we're not in full contract, but it pays off in the end on a lot of these really big, complicated projects that we do. But I think one thing that is really key when you're trying to balance these costs is getting the most out of, especially off-site systems. Whereas each project we come to look at generally is a one-off. You're starting reinventing the wheel. If there can be more repetition and economies of scale, then the savings are quite extraordinary. When we used to do Tesco stores, for instance, there, because you had a similar design there, you
kind of replicated it through.
Replicate it, and so the design period, instead of being 12 weeks, suddenly went down to 6 weeks. And because the same people working it, as you do things with repetition, you get quicker and faster. And so rather than just cutting margins, we're not saying you have to fill the world with identical boxes. Often you can just standardize details, but there doesn't seem to be, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas, because it puts engineers and architects out of a job if you're just going to reuse things. But I think we need to explore that to try and find ways of making savings using these different processes.
Brilliant. I've got one more question for you, John, before we go to the next question. Housing. Housing's always been at the forefront, especially in developing countries, and we know that housing will grow, but we need sustainable, affordable housing. How do you think the technologies that you're using with timber could help with that, or is it just the commercial request that you've asked for, or is it not viable from a residential point of view?
A lot of it's in perception. I mean, different parts of the world, housing is normal to do it in timber frame, whereas England, where I am, it's always viewed still with some skepticism. I think a lot of it is because you have to, the main contractors, the builders, have to make more of a long-term commitment. When you're doing trad build, you can turn off the building on and off with a tap, but with off-site construction, you have to plan ahead and commit. And I think that's one of the things that has put off large scale, and also large scale investment. We've seen a number of volumetric companies in the UK folding after huge investment in them because the demand hasn't been consistent. So again, it's leading towards governments giving that consistency, especially in things like social housing. If they can give that demand there, then people will provide the supply. But when you set up these big factories and then suddenly the demand gets turned off, you're just sitting there with the costs escalating. And so this is what stops the full use of off-site systems for timber. And it's definitely it's not the answer to everything, but it's part of the solution, I think, there. But also it brings into other things which we'll come on to later, things like insurance. All these things are joined up. You can't just look at it in isolation.
No, I think you're right. I think that there's a whole lot that goes into that kind of decision-making process before we can get to, I guess, achieving sustainable goals. I'm going to move on to the next question now, in terms of how can organisations align reward for decision makers and incentivize for meeting or coming to below budget and achieving cost savings with long-term sustainability goals? I feel that a lot is to do with that kind of short-term fix about, we've got CEOs being in position maybe 5 years, we've got shareholders chasing you down for results, and the kind of sustainability goals kind of with that cost element goes out the window. Andrew, do you think that we can incentivize people on the flip side for achieving those goals, and what does that look like?
Yes, I do, essentially. I guess there's two quite different things I'd like to say on it. I guess the first one is maybe just think about what really motivates people. So what do we mean by incentivization? And then the other aspect is probably the impact of finance. And in terms of incentivization, I guess, again, I'm going to slightly challenge the premise of the question. Because I think in infrastructure, actually, and certainly in the public sector, the incentive isn't monetary, at least for individuals. So, many people involved in infrastructure projects are motivated either by doing big stuff or more broadly by doing something that's beneficial for society. And actually, that's quite a big driver for lots of individuals. And so the opportunity, when I think about sustainability, the opportunity to tackle two of the world's most pressing challenges in terms of how do you replumb the economy to work without fossil fuels and waste, and how do you develop the built environment in a way that actually supports and regenerates ecosystems, actually that's hugely motivational for many people. So I think those sorts of incentives are kind of already there, and perhaps we sometimes underestimate them. Now, that's how it maybe works for individuals, or could do. I think it's certainly true that for organisations, actually the decision-making frameworks aren't there. Whether it's formal or just kind of cultural, our decision-making frameworks are very cost-based. And we know that, we just look at the collateral damage that our development over the last 200 years has caused in terms of what we've done to the planet. And that's because our decision-making frameworks just don't cope with those questions about how you look after the natural world. So I think it still feels like an environment where, as an individual and an organisation, you have to be really bold, brave even, if you're going to prioritise those things, almost despite your decision-making framework, in terms of the way in which value is monetised. I would certainly, when it comes to the sustainability type issues, I would generally be cautious of attempting to monetize it, because the act of monetization then creates a trade-off. The intent is sort of well meant, but inevitably what you're doing is trying to put a price on something that is arguably priceless, and in doing that, you can quite easily find yourself in a place where sort of monetization of the natural world just becomes a way of justifying trading it off. So I think a more kind of sophisticated decision-making framework is needed. The other piece that I wanted to talk about was the impact of finance, and I think in the UK we stopped doing private finance some years ago.
Yep. I
think we'll probably see it coming back in again in some form or another. We've seen that with Euston Station and HS2, and I think we may see a broader role over the next 5 years or so. And that actually is a really good mechanism for driving longer term thinking. It shifts the thinking from how do we get a construction project done to what does long-term value look like, how would we measure it, and how would we make that work in a commercial and financial model. So, actually, in terms of not only whole life cost, but also the sustainability of our infrastructure, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about if we see more private finance back in the system in the UK.
Thank you, Andrew. Chloe, I wanted to ask you, when you're kind of advising that C-suite of clients, around sustainability goals, I guess. Is this something they actively look for, or is this something that you advise on, or is it something that you can influence on?
It's definitely something that we can advise on, and it's something that they do want advice on more and more, especially on the major programs. We have also been part of developing balanced scorecards. So to Andrew's point there about coming up with robust ways to measure sustainability and other benefits other than cost and program have been a challenge over the last few years, and it is something that is still very much developing. Coming up with a balanced scorecard that actually aligns with the strategy and the vision of a particular program or project, and then actually taking those elements and contracting them to your supply chain, so making sure that everybody's aligned to that vision and to those metrics is absolutely key. And I think we're finding that on the very major programs with these so many moving parts, it's something that is developing. But there are initiatives like the NEC4 contract, which is being widely used across the public sector now. And they've introduced specific whole life costing clauses now. So there's secondary clause X21, which is about giving suppliers the opportunity to change the scope to come up with more sustainable aspects of the design or methodology as well. There's secondary clause X29, which comes up with a performance table. So what a client can do is translate their objectives into a performance table and actually contract that to a supplier, and then use things like performance damages. So if those aren't met, that there are ways to actually incentivize. And it's the monetizing, which I know Andrew said we should caution against, but there are contractual mechanisms to do that. And I think if they're properly considered up front, so if they are reasonable, that is a really structured way to align your objectives and get that golden thread all the way down through to your suppliers.
I think you're right. I think we need something in practice, and whether or not that's contractual or CEOs pay that's pegged in or into their ESG goals, to make sure that this has been done, because there aren't any other mechanisms, are they, that we have got, and we need to pull those levers that we can control to make sure that we've got these goals in place and there are these long-term savings. But Matthew, in terms of, I'm just going to kind of fly out the room and say, look, what does that look like in terms of the longevity of our surveying practices? I mean, in terms of that decision making, what kind of advice are we giving our clients so they can make those educated kind of decisions, I guess?
In terms of what whole life costs, so how are they being able to predict it in terms of the asset models that we would help produce? Well, what we try to do there is we try to have robust asset models that are able to predict costs. We try and use the data. We engage with industry, we engage with supply chain to try and produce an asset model that's going to give us an output that gives us a level of accuracy. But that is tricky because some of the assets, the lifespans are 120 years. So predicting technology, economic conditions, legislation that's going to be implemented can be an obstacle. But by putting our best foot forward in terms of looking at the data that we've got, as I just mentioned, working with supply chain and industry, we can try and produce an accurate prediction for a new asset. And with the existing assets, we can then start looking at the condition of them, looking at technology, how can we enhance that asset moving forward. So that's how we can start building more robust whole life cost models. And it is something that we're having to try and support a little bit more because the data's out there. It's just a case of standardizing it and then trying to automate it and use it the best way that we can.
And in terms of, I guess, those challenges that we have, we've also got, we can create a library. We've got historical data and we've got benchmarking data. We don't have a crystal ball. Surveyors can make a prediction of what we know now. How can technology help us in that, do you think?
I think that there's an opportunity that we are looking to digitalise the quantification stages with cost estimating, and can we also apply that same method when we're looking at quantifying and producing activities in design models? So if we're doing that for the CapEx, can we also actually look at producing carbon outputs as well that can be calculated at the same time? Can we also do it for whole life costs? So actually when we get a digital design model, we've got that from the design and engineering input, and then maybe we have a database that's set in carbon, a database that's set in CapEx, a database that's set in life cycle, and maybe try and have an initial estimate on all three of those things at the same time. So really enhancing digitalization to automate those three things. And then also you're not necessarily going to be impacting a program. It's not an additional activity. If you build it in within your digital design models, you're able to automate that side of things, and it comes forward.
No, that's great. I think technology is ever moving fast, and we're still playing catch up, I think, here within our industry, and it's very kind of hand clunk, and we're working with Excel and we're working with various software houses, and then AI is the buzzword around what should we do with it. And I think this is a growth area, I think, for us in the surveying community to harness that and to say, actually, look, we've got data, we've got benchmarking, we've got historical evidence of what we know, and it's almost like, can we plug this in to predict what that future is going to look like? And I think it's an amazing time at the moment, but if we can link that back into sustainability in terms of actually, if we put a product out there, or if we do something now, what does that saving look like later on? So we know we're seeing like kind of a higher energy cost. So if we can do something now to counteract that, that's brilliant. It's a win-win for both.
Yeah, and what a great way of recruiting the next future generation of surveyors. How attractive does that sound when you're getting some really good design models in that you're positively improving sustainability on projects? That's how you're really going to engage and bring through the next future generation of surveyors as well, because it becomes much more attractive. We're not sat in a room doing takeoffs on dim paper anymore. We're actually using digital design models, and also impacting on decisions with sustainability aspects like carbon and with social values. So I think it's a really good opportunity as well for the profession to help bring more professionals into the industry.
Brilliant. I'm just going to take a question from the floor at the moment, and one of them is around about global standardization and reporting on whole life costing. And I want to link it back to the RICS whole life carbon assessment. So we know that there's nuances everywhere. We can't record data from one entity or from one region or one country, but we can start doing the practice. I think that's the fear, is that we don't do this enough of recording our carbon data. What kind of blockers do you think there are in the market at the moment that are stopping people from providing this whole life carbon, a from a cost point of view and data from a carbon point of view?
I think it's partly standardization at the moment. So I think when people calculate carbon, there are different databases out there. There's different assumptions, there's bases of estimates. So a standardization will help that. And the guidance I think the RICS are providing will help with that standardization as well, in terms of how we're going to quantify it, how we're going to underpin those activities, and then ultimately how we price it. So I think there's a lot of different ways of how people are doing it at the moment, but by bringing ourselves together, I think it was touched on earlier, we can collaborate more, and then we can talk to each other with the same data sets. And once you've done that, once you've standardized it, then you can start doing more automation around the analytics that goes with that, the reporting, because it becomes a more consistent model.
Brilliant. Andrew, I want to kind of bring you into the fold in terms of that kind of whole life cost and the challenges around forecasting. What did you face in your project? So I'm really interested in terms of that kind of the on the ground kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the principal challenge with whole life cost modelling is uncertainty, right? So predicting a whole life cost or doing a model for whole life cost is relatively straightforward. With our assets, roads, we kind of understand how they work. the sorts of activities that are required to maintain and operate them. But the further you go into the future, the more uncertain that future looks, and the way in which those activities might be carried out maybe looks quite different. So I think, we try to look much more at this as in terms of kind of uncertainty and ranges of possible outcomes, and try and understand the asset from that point of view, rather than trying to pinpoint an exact number in terms of a whole life cost. I think a sort of extension of that question about uncertainty, Matthew talked about assets lasting 120 years. What are the chances we even need the asset in 120 years' time? Having a great whole life cost model of something that it turns out you no longer need after 50 years, that's kind of blown out the water any of those bits of uncertainty you might have had in the model. So I think there's definitely something about trying to take a broad view on what are the uncertainties in that forward forecast.
Great, thank you. I want to kind of skip over to kind of John now and help us a bit more on the kind of supply chain and technology as well. Timber frame, it's been around for a long time, John. What advances have we seen in terms of the technology that you guys are using at the moment?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, it used to be this very old-fashioned material compared to steel and concrete. But I mean, the design advances, especially things like parametric models, have made these very organic freeform shapes not only technically possible, but economically possible. A couple of years ago, we did the McKellen Distillery in the Highlands, and it's sort of this sort of Teletubby land, but it's got an incredible sort of a cathedral to whiskey, and the roof really is a cathedral to timber. And it does just show what is possible with the advances in technology. But it does need the right people. I think people tend to dumb it down. Oh, you just press a button, this amazing program sort of churns it all out. But it really does need people. And one of the challenges we have in the UK, all the engineers trained on steel and concrete, and so of course they are not as familiar with other materials, and so there's other barriers really. And I think education, and what we're finding with technology is what it's given is this endless cycle of hell really of during design meetings of endless choices. And it's what we need to do is have very strong management controlling this process, because we're finding the design process on projects is taking longer because there's endless choices of what ifs as people explore things. And a lot of it is down to education, but also this need for strong management really to sort of control the process as we go along, because it is, burning up a lot of energy on it really.
And is that with more of a behavioural issue, or kind of systemic, to think, okay, we only build in concrete and brick and steel? In
the UK it is. We have a really strong
do they not think outside the box to think we can have the same structure in timber, for example?
No, a lot of it is people obviously risk and fear of the unknown and change. And culturally in the UK we're brought up with the story of the three little pigs, whereas the house made out of timber falls down is rubbish. So there, and obviously in different markets and people are used to different things. On there, I mean, we're seeing 3D models coming in now, and you see them, but quite often at tender stage you can see images of the 3D model, but the contractors bidding will not be sent the model to price off of. We have to price off flat 3D PDFs. So although there is technology there, it's not always being used enough on there. So again, I think a lot of it is people rather than just the technology. I think the technology is we're trying to catch up with it at the moment. And that seems to be, and I think AI is something that we're seeing a lot of being talked about. But again, it's who's going to be setting its parameters on there, because if it carries on with the current sort of going for the lowest cost model, it's going to very brutally bring in just a total low cost, bring us with every tender. And low cost does not equal best value. And I think that's really the key thing that people need to understand. When you're buying something, you don't say what's the cheapest, but that's how a lot of tenders are being procured at the moment, because often at design stage the tenders come in from the main contractors, and all of them are higher than the cost plan. And so that forces very late VE to slash through the design, and that takes away a lot of the long-term whole life costing that's been designed in. And so really, if you can incentivize the design team to design so it comes in within budget, I think that's something that's got to be explored, because we're seeing it so often, this value under the term value engineering, and they just cut out this long-term view.
And do you think that's more of a like an educational process where, you know, we don't have the skill set, or do we not teach that, you know, there are other materialities out there, you know, sustainable materials, or
there's a lot of knowledge out there, Amit, and it's, you know, it does vary. But one of the other things we're seeing, especially in the UK, is this aging population, and gradually a lot of knowledge, as people now in their sort of late 50s and 60s are starting to come out of the industry, there isn't, and at the other end, there wasn't the thing of bringing in enough apprentices or trainees. We did rely on a lot of experience coming in from Europe, which of course ended after Brexit, and we do have a real void, especially in the UK, of experience. And I think there's something that needs to be addressed, the whole bringing in younger people and getting them on proper apprenticeships and technical things, rather than just getting them to university to get a degree. It's much more, as I work for an Austrian company in here, they really do streamline young people into technical roles at an early age with proper apprenticeships. And I think that's what we need to do looking forward, because there doesn't seem to be that enough coming through.
Well, that kind of slipped me into my next kind of question, one for probably Chloe, about, you know, how can government and professional bodies encourage adoption for a whole life approach? You know, does it kind of stem from policy, or does it go all the way back to education? Do you need to put more investment in like R&D, in technology, materiality, all these kind of things that, you know, we can't really affect, but government can influence and provide tax incentives, can kind of put funding together. What's your view on that in terms of maybe what the government can do? Or,
well, I think we're starting to see a shift. The PAS 2080, that's it's encouraging the industry to report on whole life costing metrics. The EIA regulations are also being developed, so that now includes the entire operation and not just the project phase or construction phase. So industry standards, if we are going to enforce that sustainable elements are used in construction, the industry standards may need to change accordingly. It takes time, it takes investment, it takes money to test these and to have them approved. So it's not something that can be immediately fixed. I think there's definitely a will to bring to make it a more greener economy. The UK have set a goal by 2050 to be to be carbon neutral. So, you know, we've got that is those are set in frameworks. People have to, and the industry has to support that. But like I think I mentioned earlier, there's very limited funds at the moment in the industry to really to spend that extra money on innovation, and safety will always trump innovation from a public perspective. So there are those trade-offs. Fortunately, there are initiatives where there is dedicated funding in place to support sustainable projects and programs. But there's also that upfront investment in the planning to make sure that you have outlined your sustainable goals adequately, so that you can actually take advantage of those funding arrangements. So it's in the early stages. The big programs are setting are blazing ahead. There are suppliers that are coming in, early engagement, I think. But to John's point there, if timber is not that popular in the UK or in other markets, early supplier engagement is probably going to only really focus on the expertise of those suppliers that you bring in early. There's also, wider issues to be considered, and I think organizations are trying to deal with that. I think there was quite a reactive approach to hyperinflation. It took a lot of projects by surprise post-COVID with exceptionally high costs. So those all need to be factored in, and I definitely feel that when it comes to if there are sustainable technologies that need to be focused on, the UK government needs to look at ways of tariffs and ways to alleviate the costs of those, to encourage people to use them in construction, because price is still going to be one of the major drivers for the approach to how you're going to construct an asset.
Brilliant, thank you, Chloe. I think we can carry on this conversation for another hour. I think we've come up to the hour now, and I want to invite everyone back onto the screen and kind of give one lasting thought in terms of something that we can do, or something that we take away that you're doing now, or something that you want to put forward to do. So I want to go around the screen, and one of your lasting thoughts and on sustainability and your approaches, really. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you. If you've got your kind of 10 seconds to kind of your last spiel, what do you want to say to the audience?
Well, I guess it's a sort of prediction, and that's to say, I guess my view is that zero carbon, nature positive, they're going to become non-negotiable requirements within the next 15 years in the UK. And those organisations that show they're really good at delivering those things in the built environment are going to attract investment, and those that can't won't.
Survive or die, isn't it, kind of mentality?
Yeah.
John,
yeah,
how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, really, if you're not looking at this sort of whole life costing, your competitors will be. And I think going forward, you can't just carry on business as usual. That'll be my take on this. Do get that collaborative early engagement. Yeah.
Thank you, John. Matthew, yourself?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more requests in the space, more whole life cost and CapEx to be completed together. So I just encourage everyone to engage further, to understand more and train themselves up, because you don't want to miss out. And there's also a big opportunity for the RICS to shape and promote this as well. So look forward to seeing that.
Thank you, Matthew. And Chloe, last kind of remarks.
Absolutely. We're no longer in a space where we can consider either CapEx or whole life costing. We've got to look at the whole life cycle of the asset upfront, plan accordingly, and make sure that we consider the sustainability and climate impacts, as well as social benefits, cost and program.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chloe. I think we've got some really great closing remarks here, and some really thought-provoking I see conversations that we can still carry on and take back to our offices, to take back to a conversation with our colleagues, etc. I'd like to thank the people who have logged on to this call, and I'd like to thank our panelists, really, for taking the time out today in their busy schedule to kind of share their experience with us today. So Chloe, thank you very much. Andrew, well done. Thank you for giving your insight. John, always on the timber front in terms of your valid kind of experience in that, and Matthew as well, especially from a consultant point of view, having that viewpoint of what we're facing as surveyors. So I'd like to say thank you very much for your time today. We're going to try and bring this to a close, and I think that the next screen up is on the here we go. So the future webinar. So we've got a list of future webinars that are coming through. So please take a note of this. The team will probably email out, and there'll be some more probably messaging on LinkedIn. There's some great opportunity. They are free to kind of log into. And there's the topical subjects at the moment. So things like digital transformation, markets and geographics, natural environment and urbanization. So I think there's a lot more to come in terms of the WebEFs. Once again, thank you very much for your time today, and much appreciated.